Well, then, wow, what a night UFC 287 was. A lot that we have to get into on this new post-fight stream. Israel Adesanya, once again, the UFC middleweight champion. George Masvidal lives up to his promise, loses to Gilbert Burns, and puts the gloves down and retires seemingly from MMA. And then just a whole lot of other things to talk about with the lower portion of the card. So welcome everybody to a special live stream edition of the MMA Outsiders. Make sure to hit that like button, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to get notified of everything here at the Empty Bench Network, including everything MMA Outsiders, our episodes that air Wednesday mornings, 9 a.m. Eastern, and these different live streams that pop up every now and again. That's Zain Bando. You can follow him at Zambando99. He's a staff writer at bjpen.com. You can find his writing work there. I'm Tom Albano. You can find my work over at Fansided MMA and follow me on Twitter at Thomas J. Albano. All right, Zan. A lot to digest. We have a new UFC middleweight champion, or in this case, a once again UFC middleweight champion. George Masvidal retired. Raul Rosas Jr. drops at a very disappointing fight. We had a banger of a fight of the night in the featured prelim bout of the evening. We had a couple of different fighters on the prelims, one being our guy Joe Pfeiffer, who impressed, and then another who may have basically just caused herself to lose her job after a fantastic performance. We'll get into all of that, plus some notes that Dana White mentioned at the UFC 287 post-fight press conference last night. But we begin with the story. Israel Adesanya, once again UFC middleweight champion of the world, knocking out Alex Pereira in 2 rounds. So, Zan, you were kind of on the ball in this one. So whereas I called the finish of the first MMA fight, let me specify the first MMA fight because these two had fights in kickboxing around the time that we were either just getting into MMA media or before that. Alex Pereira had a decision win and a knockout win in kickboxing, had the comeback knockout finish at Madison Square Garden back in November. And I say you called it also because the fight actually did kind of start out very similar to their first fight, in which you saw a lot of slow pacing. You saw Adesanya trying to keep his distance away from Pereira's power. And Adesanya is a guy who has a very long reach. And then you saw Adesanya basically get troubled seemingly by Pereira, back forced against the cage, and they're kind of talking about at the press conference, Israel Adesanya, who Muhammad Ali is one of the people that he looks up to, basically had his rope-a-dope moment, and whereas he seemed trouble, whereas it seemed like where Mark Goddard stopped the fight in the first MMA fight in November, Adesanya was given a chance, and basically all it took was a combination, a right hook to drop Pereira out cold. So, Zan, you have to be impressed by the performance of Israel Adesanya, right? Probably one of the most emotional victories we've seen in his career. As I said in Fansided, it may not have been his first title win, it may not have been his first win in MMA, but it was definitely the sweetest.
Yeah, this is one that he had been clamoring for several months now, and he even predicted it a couple of days ago, and he re-emphasized it at the weigh-ins, and he's like, what if I go in? What if I go in and just dispose of him? What if I go in and starch him? And that's exactly what he did, and it looked very much like the first fight. Pereira was landing good combinations. It looked like Adesanya was, fighting off of his back foot for a little bit, and that temple shot has been like one of those punches that has really ended some legendary fights in the past. One that comes to mind, of course, is Brock Lesnar versus Randy Couture. Obviously, Adesanya didn't follow up because he didn't need to. The stoppage was what it was. Pereira was totally out, but it was just one of those knockouts where it was you didn't see it coming, but you knew if you had been following Adesanya this entire fight week and leading up to the fight, he was laser focused on this fight. You heard him say nothing about fights in the future, who he wants next, anything like that. He was solely focused on beating his rival, beating his boogeyman, as you put it last night, and how you framed everything leading up to the fight last night was, could he dispose of his boogeyman, and he did exactly that. And without a doubt, you have to start putting him in that upper echelon of not only one of the greatest middleweight UFC fighters ever, but you want to talk about future UFC Hall of Famer status. I think that knockout last night either cemented it, or he's pretty damn close to it. That's for sure. Because I think he reignited a division that needed some life in it. We were worried that the division was going to be stale for a bit, and now, even though it could still very well look that way because he has disposed of the top five, but now you're going to have a lot of different challengers, looking his way and whatnot. And I just thought overall a very impressive performance for Adesanya, a beautiful knockout. And I don't know, man. We're gonna get into this in a little bit, but just on the brief topic of an immediate rematch, a trilogy fight. I mean, it's literally right in the UFC's lap at this point. It looks like Dana nor Israel want to budge, and that it's very interesting to take that cautious approach right after now one of the craziest knockouts we've seen this year, and it's almost like you have a third fight right in your lap and you're not going to take it. I think it's very interesting, to kind of look through and see, like, okay, what does this rivalry really mean? And I do think now that, again, as I said previously, you have to start looking at Adesanya as easily one of the best middleweights ever, and obviously the numbers for title defense prove that. So there you go.
Yeah, and you were talking about what this does for Adesanya's career, and that's the thing, Zan. It kind of just obviously he's fought Pereira before. Obviously, he's been UFC middleweight champion previously, but this just expands his legacy because, as I said, this was probably the most emotional win he had. You saw the outpouring of emotion in that post-fight celebration. You saw the outpouring of emotion as he was announced as the new UFC middleweight champion, and you saw that post-fight promo where basically talking about the fighting spirit of human beings and why you never give up. He talked about having a mission, as you said, and being so laser focused on it that it was accomplished. And a lot of us, myself included, doubted it. I mean, we were cringing. People were cringing when we saw him with the dog collar around his neck at the press conference. People were cringing when he came out to Trap's Headstrong. But I tweeted, I said, I thought Headstrong was a very appropriate song because he is headstrong for taking on somebody who had a 3-0 record against him. And it looked like Zan had, there been a wrong decision made in that moment, it could have gone to 4-0. So for Israel Adesanya to get this win, it is incredible. And like you said, now we're talking future UFC Hall of Famer territory. Uh, as far as for what's next, I mean, Zan, it's really interesting to see what matchups get to have rematches and trilogies and what don't. Obviously, we'll get into it a little bit, but just the fact that teams like we're not going to get Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira 3 or 5 if you count the kickboxing fights, but we're going to get Amanda Nunes versus Juliana Pena 3. I think it's like those things don't even out. Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira, the kind of circumstances we're talking about, that brutal knockout, the comeback knockout by Pereira in the first MMA fight, the brutal knockout by Adesanya in this one, and the outpouring of emotion, especially when in both circumstances of MMA fights, the other person, the one who ended up losing, seemed to have the upper hand before it all came crashing down. This, to me, like you said, Zan, it screams trilogy. It screams that it's in the lap of the UFC. But it doesn't seem like Adesanya wants to do it, and it doesn't seem like Dana White wants to do it. Now, go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, and I was just gonna say, like, even back to me saying it's in the UFC's lap. Not only is it in the UFC's lap, you want to talk about a massive number three. You want to talk about the stakes being probably the biggest they've been in the middleweight division, and I would argue in 10 years. I mean, you want to talk about, if you can recall, I think we were following the sport at the time, but I would argue after last night's win for Adesanya that a potential third fight between those two is bigger than both of Anderson Silva, both of the Anderson Silva Sonnen fights combined. Just because now you have this extra flair. It's 1-1. They have the kickboxing history. It's clear that they respect their fighting styles. They respect their games. You either like Pereira or you like Adesanya. There's no in between. To me, it feels like potentially the biggest, not only middleweight trilogy ever, but I think the biggest middleweight title fight. This potential third one, if it ever happens, in probably about a decade.
And I want, and part of me, Zan, wants to scream, "Are you nuts?" Because we're talking about Anderson Silva, Chael Sonnen, and the epic rivalry there. But I think the numbers last night prove something. I mean, sixth highest gate in UFC history. Dana mentioned, I don't have the specific numbers in front of me to confirm, but Dana mentioned this fight beat out the live gate from Madison Square Garden just a few months ago when they had their first MMA fight. I
The
have to
gate
wonder
was
how many.
the
Yeah,
gate was around 11.5 million.
11.9 million. Yeah, I don't have the UFC 281 numbers to confirm that.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
I understand. Yeah.
Um, but I wonder again. This goes to, we don't really get to see the pay-per-view numbers often because of the ESPN deal. But I have to wonder how many pay-per-view buys this got.
Oh, I mean, I'm sure it did very well considering, and you probably would agree with this too. Did you think that the promotion for this fight all week was just off the charts? I thought it was awesome.
Absolutely. Oh, by the way, actually can confirm. Yes, it beat out Madison Square Garden. The
Wow.
the UFC 281 was 11.56 million.
Wow. Wow.
And I think part of that is a mix, and part of that is a mix of this fight, and part of it is a mix of that this was the first UFC card in Miami in 20 years, and you threw on both Israel Adesanya in a fight where, we just talked about the kind of history and rivalry that he has with Alex Pereira, and of course, George Gamebred Masvidal. Like you
Um,
said, I think the promotion for this was off the chart.
for sure. And I have to mention this because it seems like nobody has yet in the MMA sphere. Isn't it interesting to you that 20 years after the UFC's first event in Miami, we had a middleweight title fight, and 20 years ago we had Rich Franklin taking on Evan Tanner. Rich Franklin ended up going on to become UFC middleweight champion. I just find that kind of ironic that both of those things coexisted in the same city.
I know. I actually mentioned, I think in my post-fight numbers and bonuses piece on Fansided. Last time the UFC was here in Miami, because everyone says, "Oh, it's been 20 years." What the heck that event was? That event was UFC 42, Sudden Impact, on April 25th, 2003. So almost 20 years exactly. The main event of that fight card, Sam, was Matt Hughes defeating Sean Shirk by unanimous decision to retain the UFC welterweight championship.
It's pretty ironic, and that's a fight that if you have not watched it, go back and watch it because it's one of those underrated 5 round fights that had just nonstop action the entire fight.
And actually,
And
Zan,
then,
what's
oh, go
sorry,
ahead, go ahead. Sorry, no,
a weird
go
thing.
ahead.
A weird thing, by the way. You mentioned Rich Franklin and Everett Tanner about the middleweight. That fight was actually contested at light heavyweight on this card.
That's pretty. That's pretty wild to think about too. My a point was that Rich Franklin ended up going on to become middleweight champion, and now 20 years
Oh no,
later, we have
I
a
know, I knew what you meant. I knew what you meant, and
yeah,
I know
yeah,
both Franklin and Tanner are middleweight fighters, but this one, for whatever reason, was competed at a light heavyweight. I don't
yeah,
understand
yeah.
why.
Yeah, that
Oh,
is very interesting.
another fun fact. This was the card that Joe Rogan was the lead commentator for, and he had Phil Baroni and Eddie Bravo. This is the one I assume that afterwards Rogan texted Mike Goldberg and said, "Never miss another fight card again."
Yeah, he's even admitted on his podcast that he hated every second of that event because he had no idea what he was doing. Yeah,
Uh, but yeah, going back to this topic, like I said, it's kind of interesting what gets rematches and trilogies and what doesn't. I don't understand how you're gonna tell me that Nunes versus Pena requires a trilogy, but not a MMA. Like I said, granted they've had two kickboxing fights before this, but not Adesanya versus Pereira and the kind of finishes that we had in those fights. Uh, and considering the state of the rest of the challengers that at middleweight, because on the last episode of Outsiders, Dan, we even went through it and said, what do you do without a signing with a loss? I mean, with a win, I don't think it really changes anything if you're not going to do the trilogy because he's, like you said, run through everybody in the top five already.
what makes no sense to me is it's like if Pereira had won a controversial decision, then would Dana have said, "Oh, we got to do it again"? It's like it doesn't
I guarantee you, he probably would have.
doesn't make sense to me. And as a matter of fact, too, the part that you have not mentioned that I gladly will is that speaking of a Nunes Pena trilogy, which is going to happen in June, obviously, is that Nunes 50-43 her in fight number two. You don't mean to tell me that we've seen everything we needed to see in fight number two, and we have just seen it again? And do we really think that fight number two is going to go exactly like fight number three? Because the odds or the answer is probably, as you said, both of these fights between Pereira and Adesanya were polar opposites of each other. And my argument to that whole thing is, who wouldn't want to see a trilogy between those two? Because I bet you the answer is very few. I think a lot of people, or a lot. I think very few people will tell you that they wouldn't want to see a trilogy after watching those two fights for sure. To me, it doesn't make any sense as to why the UFC wants to push this narrative. Oh, Pereira should go to 205. He's massive. We get it. He's huge. He probably should go to 205. But under these circumstances, where it's one and in MMA, you don't want to see the decider. That doesn't make sense. Yeah,
I agree. And I was going to bring up exactly you brought that. Dana White, the post fight press conference, kind of hinted that maybe Alex Pereira could consider a move up to light heavyweight. Now, granted, that would do incredible things for light heavyweight. We've talked about the struggles of light heavyweight on our show. The light heavyweight needs some juice behind it. And Alex Pereira would definitely bring some juice to that. However, you consider the fact that, I mean, Zan, like we were talking about, that Israel Adesanya, if you look at the UFC rank, now granted, I said you look at the UFC rankings, but as of Sunday, obviously they're not going to change. They're going to have a little bit of movement to them
on
afterwards,
Tuesday.
but
It'll be after. Well, they'll come out. They'll come out a day after the show is well. They'll come out definitely after this, but they'll officially be out once the new episode of Outsiders goes out for next
yeah.
week.
I mean,
Yeah.
granted, I think the only thing that we're going to see is a swap between Adesanya, this champion, Alex Pereira at number one. But Zan, you listen to these fights of the top five: Alex Pereira, Robert Whitaker, Marvin Vettori, Jared Cannonier, Paulo Costa. Which of those sounds interesting? Because I think the trilogy kind of outranks them all. I mean, Whitaker, I like Adesanya and Whitaker, but Adesanya's won both fights already, clearly won both fights already. Marvin Vettori didn't impress in that first fight. I don't know why we would have a rematch there. Cannonier, again, Adesanya kind of handled him with ease. And Paulo Costa, I mean, it's Paulo Costa. I don't know if I don't know if I want to see him in another title fight. So
Yeah, I
I
mean
mean,
your
it's
overall
not.
your overall point is that he's cleaned out the top five. Who else is there left for him to fight in the top five? I think just through
Unless
I think just through process of elimination, it
Zan,
may,
you know where I'm
it,
going with this.
no, I know. I know there's a little someone out there.
Who's ranked at number 6 that, hey, if he gets a
Oh,
win in the top 5, all of a
oh,
sudden Lucas Duplessis all of a sudden looks like a good title challenger.
I know. But never in a million years. I hate to break it to you. I'm making this bold prediction now. Never in a million years will the UFC headline Israel Adesanya versus Dricus Duplessis at a number pay per view. They will do everything they can to make sure that that fight does not happen.
I mean, Zan, it would be a great card if I mean, it would be a great headliner if, the UFC actually decided to go to Africa for once.
Well, that would be now we're making things very interesting. Then it's a fight worth paying attention to.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, but we were talking about light heavyweights. Obviously, you've got Jamal Hill, who's the champion, but that division is kind of a jumbled mix. You got Magomed Ankalaev Zan, who again might have a say that maybe that throne should be his after the controversial December bout. You've got uh,
I thought he
uh
won, as did you,
I thought
right?
he won as well. Yeah, I thought
Yeah,
he won
yeah.
as well. You've got after that, you've got, well, actually, he's number 2. Number 1 is obviously Yuri Prochazka. Technically, Yuri never lost the championship in the octagon, has been hurt. Who's going to try to make a claim? You got Jan Blachowicz at number 3, the former light heavyweight champion. And then all you got to do is add Hotan Alex Pereira to the mix. And all of a sudden, it looks like a more jumbled mess. Now, granted, again, as I said, it's gonna increase the star power of light heavyweight. And bear in mind, Alex Pereira has been a middleweight light heavyweight champ before back in Glory Kickboxing. So he can compete at light heavyweight. Granted, light heavyweight kickboxing, light heavyweight MMA, two different kind of weight classes. Regardless, my point, he would be a little shot in the arm to 205. It's just the division's already a bit of a gargled kind of mess at the top.
Okay, I'm gonna counter you and ask this question, put you on the spot. Who realistically, from the names that you just mentioned to me, all world class light heavyweights, obviously you did mention Jamal Hill, who's the champion. Who realistically, in your opinion, could Pereira actually be at light heavyweight?
Mm.
That's my biggest question.
I think he can beat Jan. I think he can beat
Really,
Blachowicz. I think so.
really interesting. That would be a firefight if that would be very very interesting.
Although it's interesting, I brought up Jan because now, obviously, with Adesanya being the champ again, you've got a couple of people calling their shots. Zen, did you see on Twitter that Jan Blachowicz is interested in a rematch with Israel Adesanya, but he wants to drop to 185?
It's a very interesting rematch, especially at a
I
different weight.
I mean, I like the sound of a rematch, but I don't know, Zan, if I like the idea of Blachowicz dropping down to 185. That's 20 pounds, 20 additional pounds into whatever he already cuts. That's a bit of a brutal weight cut. I don't know if he can
I,
handle that.
yeah, and I think he walks around at 220, so that would be brutal. That would not be a good weight cut. Yeah.
No, not at all. Um, then you've got Whitaker basically saying, "Hey, let's do it." And Zan, I think Robert Whitaker is perhaps the biggest loser in the situation. I think if Alex Pereira had retained the championship, if Alex Pereira had retained the championship, he would have been next in line for a title shot. And now he's basically got to play the waiting game again.
Well, if you think about it, the UFC is a good problem to have because if they do Adesanya Whitaker 3, they make a ton of money, and if they do Adesanya Pereira 3, it sells very well too. Those are the two biggest fights you could make at 185. So either which way the UFC goes, I think they're winning financially. It's just doesn't make logical sense considering Whitaker is down 0-2 at this point. I really don't. And so yeah, you are right in saying that he will have to play the waiting game probably, unless they make a fight later this year, probably for the remainder of the year. I would guess, unless they come with a fresh idea that has not been discussed yet, which is very well possible. Because Whitaker doesn't have a fight booked right now, does he? Right?
I do not believe so.
Okay. Because yeah, he will have to play the waiting game at least for a little bit. Um, Back to one of my original questions. I was asking or laying my case for Israel Adesanya to make the UFC Hall of Fame. Do you think this cements his place in the UFC Hall of Fame? Do you think at this point in Adesanya's career he still has more to prove, or do you think now with him not closing the chapter on the Pereira rivalry but getting one back at him, does this cement his place in the UFC Hall of Fame?
Here's what I'm gonna say. Just do I think he has more to prove? I mean, not necessarily. I mean, if he wants to try light heavyweight again, maybe, or if he wants to go down to welterweight, maybe, and to try to do the champ thing. But that's the thing. Like, I think he'll obviously do more. I don't know if he can hurt his legacy, unless, of course, he does something really stupid outside the cage. But inside the cage, I mean, Zan, BJ Penn ended his career with what, 7, 8 losses, and we consider him a Hall of Famer. I don't think Israel Adesanya has much to worry about, unless he, like I said, unless he does something stupid outside the cage.
No, I don't think he has much to worry about either. I think it's a. I think I'm sure now that he has Pereira out of the way, his next order of business before he retires, and I can't speak for him, but knowing his personality and seeing what he can bring, probably next on his bucket list, Tom, is to do a massive super fight in Africa before he retires.
Yeah, and like I said, if Dricus again, I know I'm always on the Dricus Duplessis chain, but imagine then he gets a win in the top 5, and that UFC Africa card actually comes through. You'd have Israel Adesanya, one of the champions from Africa, born in Nigeria. Remember, even though he fights out in New Zealand, born in Nigeria, against Dricus Duplessis, who was the champ of the EFC Africa in South Africa about 6 years ago. That would be a massive fight over there.
You would be if Dricus Duplessis wins the UFC middleweight championship, you would be absolutely ecstatic.
I mean, Stan, I mean, obviously I have the Dricus Duplessis vibe, but I like Adesanya, and just I'm thinking about it, Stan. All the history that both those men have with Africa, like that would be a massive fight to build over there.
It would be the UFC's version of Rumble in the Jungle. Is what it would is what it would be
Uh,
for sure.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
but yeah, no, about Adesanya, I think his legacy is pretty much cemented. Like I said, unless he does something really, really stupid, he's probably going to the Hall of Fame with this. I think he
I
just is going to expand his legacy by, like I said, becoming a champ again. Whether it's he's going to try light heavyweight again, or if he's going to try to move down to welterweight and capture that title.
Yeah, I think these two. You want to talk about Hall of Fame? I think these two fights deserve their place in the fight wing as well. Which, without a doubt, they have to. I think they've shown enough to where they were two spectacular fights to where they have to be put in their rightful places. And I think the fight wing is the perfect place for them. Again, congratulations to Israel Adesanya now becoming a two-time UFC middleweight champion and one of the most electrifying talents that you will ever see. In his next fight, no matter who it's against, is going to be a massive one. So for the moment, it's 1-1. We'll see what the UFC does from here. But as Tom and I have alluded to, if you're not advocating for a rematch after what you saw between these two, you're absolutely insane in my opinion. I feel as we alluded to at the beginning of this segment, this fight is destined for a trilogy without a doubt.
For sure. All right. Co-main events, and we ended up saying goodbye to. Speaking of a legend, we said goodbye to a legend. So Jorge Masvidal ends up losing his fight to Gilbert Burns. It's a pretty clear unanimous decision, and he basically implies his post-fight interview with Joe Rogan that he is done. And San, I liked Masvidal. I liked his little run that he had in 2019. Like it was a time 2019 when I was starting to, really get my legs under, covering this sport. And covering Masvidal's run was absolutely insane that year. However, after his performance against Gilbert Burns, I think it is kind of, in his own words, super necessary that he retires.
Yeah, what's funny is UFC 239 is the first event I remember doing coverage for myself. So to be a part of that mini run in 2019 myself, when we were first really starting to get into everything, is pretty crazy to think about it now. Almost now it's like 4 to 5 years later. Now he's hanging up the gloves. Yeah, it's been a great run. He's been a part of a lot of massive fights over the last few years. Unfortunately, we're not going to get the dream fight that I was giving you so much crap about, my dream Masvidal McGregor fight. If they both lose, it's technically still possible. It's still possible, but
It
I
is.
highly
It is,
yeah
Zan,
go,
but I don't know if I'm interested in that fight anymore. So
no
let me be
no I
clear.
know.
Let me be clear, because everyone's talking about how close the first round was. I kind of disagree. I thought, Zan, that, hang on, as a pop up comes up on my computer here. Uh, I have to disagree. I thought that Burns clearly won the first round, landing the better shot. I thought this was a clear all Burns performance, which is why I said it's kind of clear Masvidal needs to retire, and it's kind of clear that I don't have any interest in Masvidal McGregor anymore if I did before, because he just did not look good in there.
No, he didn't. And that takedown at the end of the first round solidified Burns winning that round. If he didn't think Burns won that round until the takedown, he definitely won the round with that takedown at the end of the round, without a doubt.
Hmm. And then just the fact that over the later two rounds, I mean, Santa, it kind of looked like Masvidal couldn't pull the trigger. I don't want to say that he lost his killer instinct, but there was just something there that just was that, you saw in those fights against Darren Till and Nate Diaz and Ben Askren that just was not there against Gilbert Burns.
No, it was not. And you could just tell Gilbert Burns was having fun in there. He did whatever he wanted to him, and um, I mean, it's just something where I knew Burns was going to win. I thought Burns was going to finish him. I didn't think it would go the distance, but yeah, I mean, it was one of those fights where you just kind of knew that, and unless Masvidal threw one punch to change the direction of the fight, that it wasn't going to go well. And we were both exactly right on that front. And I mean, I now Burns is back in title contention again, and it looks like, according to Dana, he's going to be the backup for the Colby Covington Leon Edwards fight, which I guess is deserving, but it leads me to believe it's like, okay, now that Gilbert Burns has won, he's retired Jorge Masvidal. It's like now he's going to potentially be granted another title shot after already losing his chance at that a bit ago. And I think it just leads me to believe that now the welterweight division is almost scapegoated, um, and not in favor of Bilal Muhammad, which is a bummer. But I think, again, kind of like what I said with middleweight, middleweight, it's a good problem to have. You have a lot of decent matchups that are there, and Gilbert Burns being the backup for Covington Edwards, I don't hate it. There's kind of that whole saga there, and then of course you still have Kamaru Usman in the mix. So welterweight is as good as it's ever been, even with the retirement of Masvidal, in my opinion.
For sure. And that's not to take away from Masvidal's career, because I had mentioned in the little breaking news piece I wrote for Fansided. I mean, this is a guy saying what 52 fights, 20 years in the sport, and he even made mention again. We know of Masvidal's story, coming from nothing, fighting in the backyards, and this sport has pretty much given him everything, and he has recognized that. He made a lot of money in the sport, and Zen. I mean, listen to these wins. I mean, Joe Lozon, Eve Edwards, where the KJ Noons, Tim Means, Michael Chiesa, James Krause, Cesar Ferreira. He had a brutal knockout at Ferreira. Um, Jake Ellenberger, Donald Cerrone, Darren Till, Ben Askren, Nate Diaz, and you consider some of the guys he was in there with losses. Rafael Sunsao, uh, Paul Daly, Toby Amada Zan. Headlined the first. So Masvidal headlined the first Bellator card. He competed in the first lightweight tournament. He was winning that fight against Amada and was the victim of probably one of the greatest submissions I've ever seen, an inverted triangle choke that he
Absurd,
didn't recognize.
absurd, absolutely absurd. It's
Masvidal probably
probably
didn't recognize he was in until it was too late.
it's probably the most underrated submission in MMA history. Is it? Is it not?
I can't believe that one doesn't get as much attention as it should.
No, I agree. Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
A lot of star-studded names and a lot of guys that fought forever and fought some huge names. And he
Gilbert
was
Melendez, Ally Quinta, Benson Henderson, Lorenz Larkin, Wonderboy, Usman, Covington,
true
Burns.
OG of the sport. He's an OG.
Yeah. So obviously, obviously the perfect time for him to retire in his hometown, Miami. Obviously, him going out on a win might have been better, but this was an all or nothing fight. If he had won, he would have been back in that title contention. And with a loss, I mean, as you mentioned, maybe the McGregor fight is still there, but that's going to be 3 or 4 years way too late. Uh, and now,
Yeah,
and now
and that's now
uh,
4 losses in a row too.
yeah. So perhaps maybe now the best time to officially hang it up. So thank you, Game Bread, for all you've done, and good luck with the future. I mean, Zan, you still got Game Bread boxing.
Yeah. Also, shout out to Dana White for mentioning Game Bread Boxing. He stayed home and watched it, and he said the event was very good. He was very impressed with the production, and as someone who was there and got to see the TV feed right above of me, Dana was not wrong. So yeah, he still has Game Bread Boxing, and they're still going to be putting on events, and I'm still definitely going to be watching them. There's a lot of very young prospects in that promotion, and Gamebird Boxing has gained a fan in me, so I'm excited to see the next phase of Masvidal's run for sure.
For sure. All right, let's take a look at some of the other fights that happened at UFC 287. Zan, Rob Font, first round knockout of Adrian Yanez, and Rob Font, safe to say he's back and he has put himself right now, Zan, in the hunt 135.
Yeah, man, the New England Cartel. He's got some brutal hands, doesn't he? um, I mean that was a thunderous knockout. Giannis, as we both know, has a granite chin. I had no idea that Giannis could get knocked out like that, but apparently he could. That was an absolutely insane fight until that knockout too. Um, but yeah, Rob Font just made his name very interesting in that division, and there's still a lot of fun fights to be had there too. That's still one of the best divisions in the sport, and he's definitely in title contention without a doubt.
Yeah, and it's not just Zan in UFC. Like we've made mention before, bantamweight I think is the most depth and the most excitement around MMA just in general. Rob Font did enter this fight at number 6. And this was a fight, Zan. This was actually his first win in a couple of years because he had dropped decisions to Jose Aldo. Last year, he only fought once, dropping a decision to Chito Vera. And I could see, Zan, with the kind of win that he has, he jumps Chito for the number 5 position, which would put him right under the likes of Peter Yan, Corey Sandhagen. Obviously, he's not going to get the next title shot because he still has another fight or two that he needs to prove. Plus, and of course, we've got the whole Sterling Cejudo fight coming up next month. And again, we talked about my feelings, and if Cejudo wins, that would be the UFC's opportunity to strike with Marab Dvalishvili. So that division's kind of insane, kind of packed. But like you said, Zan, that division has so much depth to it that you can make any sort of fights and it'd be fun.
Oh, for sure. Time is it too quick to put um Rob Fine in there with Corey Sandhagen?
I wouldn't mind a Rob Font Corey Sandhagen fight. That sounds fun as hell.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, because you know both of those guys are gonna bring it. That fight could easily go the distance, and they'll keep it standing. That's what I think.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm pretty excited for what's next for Mr. Font. Kevin Holland having a knockout of his own, taking out Santiago Ponzinibbio. This is a fight, Zan, that I thought both guys kind of needed a win, and Kevin Holland certainly he impressed. This was the kind of performance that he needed.
Yeah, he needed it badly, and I think that's your typical big mouth performance. Goes in there, talks during the whole fight, knocks out Ponzinibbio, goes over, says hi to Trump, Kid Rock, and Tyson, does his thing. Goes in the back.
Zayna said at the press. Sorry, Zayna. Zayna said at the press conference that Holland was just talking and was so excited. He had no idea what Holland was even talking about.
Yeah. You know that Kevin Holland is in a crazy week if that's the first thing that Dana could come up with, which is pretty funny. But yeah, a very impressive win. Knocked out a guy who has been around the UFC for a very long time. Has represented his country well, and he's a guy that I was high on for that fight, and I thought he would do very well and win. And it's as simple as that. He got caught. I want to know now, with Kevin Holland, kind of bouncing around between 170 and 185. Where do you think Holland fits, and where do you think he'll continue to stay? Um, where do you where do you think he'll continue to stay moving forward, in your opinion?
That's a that's a bit of a tough call. For whatever reason, I want to lean towards welterweight. I mean, this fight was at welterweight, correct? They didn't move up
Yeah,
and
yeah,
they didn't move up to middleweight because
yeah.
Santiago
According
Ponzinibbio
to
was
yes,
welterweight. Okay,
yes,
so I mean, if he got the win at welterweight, Sam, my first instinct is to say, well, try to keep the momentum going because Holland needs the momentum. So my first instinct is maybe to have him stay at 170 pounds. Granted, I mean, Zan, he lost to Derek Brunson, lost to Marvin Vettori, and obviously he had losses at welterweight too recently. But Zan, those came against Hamzat Chimaev and Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, and those two fights, Zan, I even acquiesced this on I recognized this during my storylines piece for Fansided. Those two fights you can actually give a little leeway for. Hamza Chimaev Zam was a fight that was thrown together at almost literally the last minutes because of the whole UFC 279 debacle with Nate Diaz and Tony Ferguson and that whole weight miss
right,
bonanza. And then Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, he broke his hand during the fight, which
right.
he might supposedly might have broken his hand in this fight again too. So first thing first, he's got to fix his hand. Second thing, I say, he's 3-2 at welterweight, and again the Hamza Chimaev fight you can give at least some leeway for. I think at this point he just sticks with the momentum and sticks with 170.
Really, that's very interesting. I can't disagree there, and I think he looks better at that weight than 185.
Yeah. I think he only goes to 185 if his options at 170 run out or he can't make the weight cut anymore.
Well said.
All right. Let's talk about Ro Rosas Jr. So, Zen, unfortunately, this is a case where a lot of people who were giving the UFC crap were proven correct. Raul Rosas Jr., I know what they were trying to do. 18 years old. They wanted out of Mexico. They wanted to promote him as the next big thing. And it backfired. And Zen, I would call this, I know it's very early in his career, but this is a bit of a really damaging loss for Rosas. You get put in your second fight out of coming out of the contender series onto a pay-per-view main card. You have people like Chris Curtis complaining that that spot should have been theirs, and I mean he looked good in the first round, and then I don't want to say he gave up on himself, but the minute adversity came, the minute Rodriguez got him in trouble, he just he seemed to be so baffled by adversity, and he seemed to be so, you know, shy all of a sudden that it didn't look like he knew what he was doing.
No, but I think it comes with the territory of you being 18 years old and you trying to get into the sport as
Oh, for
early as
sure.
he has. Yeah, yeah,
And I,
yeah.
I shouldn't take that away. He's 18 years old and he's learning. But I think my point, Stan, is him, Sage Northcutt, Paige Van Zandt. The UFC has a history of trying to strap rockets to people, and very rarely, Zan. I mean, to young prospects, and very rarely does it work out. Sean O'Malley might be the best case of somebody working out for the UFC.
I would somewhat disagree with you. I think it's too early to put Rob Rosas Jr. in the category of Van Sant and Northcutt. Just considering that, hang on, hear me out. Just considering that when you think about it, it's not like Christian Rodriguez was an easy fight to begin with. They were giving, if you think about it, they were giving Sage Northcutt and they were giving Van Zant these prospects that no one had ever heard of. Rodriguez was a legitimate, undefeated, like real guy that Rosas Jr. fought. They didn't just give Rosas Jr. anybody. So I
And I
think for
understand, Zan. I understand, but maybe putting him as the opener for pay per view was not a smart idea. Then maybe they should have flipped. They should have kept him as the TV prelim headliner again and put Curtis and Gastelum on the main card.
maybe, but now that it's over and that's beside the point, I think a lot more people know who Rosas Jr. is. A lot more people tuned in to watch his fight, and I think he's only going to become a bigger star because of it, because he had all of those eyeballs on him, and now they realized, okay, he lost to Christian Rodriguez. He needs to get a real camp, or he needs to get to a place where he can actually be a legitimate UFC prospect without, having to rely on, family members to be his cornermen and stuff like that. Like if the UFC slow builds him the way that I think they should, I think he's going to be just fine in the next 4 to 5 years. But if they keep doing this where they put him as the opener and stuff, and they push him to these fights that he's not ready for, he's gonna burn out quick. I understand your point, but I do think the UFC realizes who they have, and I don't think, knowing what they know about his star power and how much they preach over building a PI in Mexico or doing all these things, I really do think that the UFC knows what they're doing and they're not going to skyrocket him the way that I think a lot of people were thinking of. I think they realize who they have. They have a rare talent, and I think he's gonna be okay. I really do.
All I all I can say, Zan, is I hope you're right. Although I will give credit to Dana with some recognition in the post fight press conference, realizing that they're screwing up a big opportunity with Mexico. They've got three Mexican champions. They've got this kid, this 18-year-old kid that they're putting behind. They have to put a card in Mexico soon. Especially Zan, because they're running some risk. What happens if come I think it's July. Yeah, it's International Fight Week. What happens if Volkanovski beats Yair and Yair doesn't have the championship behind him anymore? Obviously, you can still throw him on the card, but would it mean as much if Yair loses the championship?
Probably not. I think you would need Alcantara to win that fight to really get some legs behind a massive Mexico pay per view. Yeah.
And that's the thing. So
I mean,
obviously, you're
shoot,
right.
Tom, when the UFC came to Mexico City for UFC 180, Cain Velasquez didn't even have line the card. That's another. That's another thing you have to remember was Fabricio Verdum and Mark Hunt from what I recall.
That,
Well, so even
that's
even
true.
even then, that was a drop of the ball by the UFC 8 9 years ago.
So that's the other thing, Sam. Just this loss combined with if Yair loses to Volk in July, I think this is a big fumbling of the Mexico bag for the UFC.
I think so too.
I think that's the one. Like I want to hope you're right on they know what they're doing with Rosas, but I'm a little concerned, and part of it I think is because they have an opportunity for Mexico, and they're just really screwing it up.
I agree. And yeah, I mean they just announced well, no, Dana actually did reveal it to post fight pressure that Volk Rodriguez is not confirmed for IFW, even though multiple reports are suggesting otherwise.
I mean, I love Volk Yair, and I love the fact we're getting that matchup. And I've talked about really looking forward to it, Zan. I really hope that's not the UFC 290 International Fight Week headliner. But it seems like, according to reports by like Helwani and other people, the Jones Stipe negotiations are going south.
Oh my goodness, are you serious? Oh jeez.
So this is the bag again. Obviously, you're talking Mexico versus international, but the bag is being pummeled.
I mean, if you think about it, the UFC 276 headliner wasn't great either. The last big international fight week card that they've had was the one that I was at.
Poirier McGregor 3. Poirier
Yeah,
McGregor 3.
yeah.
This
I don't know,
is
man. International fight week does not mean as much as what it used to. In my opinion, used to be this whole week celebration, and now it's a totally watered down. It's kind of a bummer.
and it's a shame considering the kind of Hall of Fame class that we're going to have. Like, this is, we have to have a big main event. We've got to have Jones versus Stipe headline International Fight Week.
It has to happen. It has to. Because think about it. Ideally, what you want is UFC 290 to be Jones Miocic. You want UFC 291 July 29th to be Edwards Covington. You want UFC 292 to ideally be McGregor versus Chandler, but it's not going to be until 293 or 294. That's just a wild guess. So you're gonna need to fill some sort of gap for 292 for a title fight that I'm not currently thinking of. But yeah, if you want to have a massive summer, before even getting to 291 and 292, you need to get the heavyweight championship to be the main event for July 8th. It has to happen.
Let's talk about some prelim fights that were notable. Zan, I think this one deserves its own banner because this one deserves its own flowers. Kelvin Gastelum, another guy who needed a big win, and not only did he get a big win, Zan, but he versus Chris Curtis absolutely delivered, earned fight of the night honors.
Yeah, I gotta admit, I lost a bet on this one. I bet Curtis, and that decision pissed me off because I did not score the fight for Gastelum. But I will admit the fight was tremendous. That second round has to be one of the best second rounds of the year so far, if not the best second round of the year. I mean, those guys gave it everything they had in there. Wouldn't you say so?
I thought that was a brawl. I thought those two really brought it, and that you saw Gastelum kind of basically throwing all the power that he could, looking a little tired by the end, but I mean those two took, those two ate, and those two brought everything that they had. That was the definition of a firefight.
Yeah, and you didn't know who Chris Curtis was before this fight. You definitely know who he is now. The hardcores knew who he was. The casuals, maybe not so much. I think if you saw Chris Curtis for the first time last night, you definitely know who he is now. That's for
I
sure.
and Zan, I hope the only thing that happens with the rankings come later this week is I hope that they flip Gastelum to 14 and Curtis to 15, and that's it. I don't want either of those guys to lose ranking after this. And I
No,
don't
I
think they
don't. No, I don't. I don't think they will either. Or at least if the UFC rankings panelists are smart. So
That's keyword is if they're smart.
yes.
All right. Some other notable prelim bouts. Zen, what have we always said to be Joe Piper? And Joe Piper kind of showed why, and I think it's a little bit of a robbery that he didn't get a performance bonus, although Dana kind of referenced the post-fight press conference. He'd take care of Joe.
Yeah, I mean, but I mean, he literally gave him money to buy his first place. He, so he, so he should. And even though Dana doesn't know who we are, he should also take care of him, considering the fact that we're a part of the unofficial Joe Piper fan club. I mean, let's be honest here. We were ecstatic. We were ecstatic over text last night when he won. So that was awesome. Um,
Absolutely was. Steve Garcia, got to give flowers to for a really brutal knockout of Shaylin Nurdanbeek.
I want to bet. I want to bet on that too. I bet the under. I bet the under 2.5 rounds. Well, thank you, Ian Parker for the nice prop.
Um, both women's fights, Pinheiro versus Waterson, Godinez defeating Calvillo, ending with some controversy. Actually, I should say both women's fight on the TV prelims. There was the opening bout between Sam Hughes, Jacqueline Morum.
That was a
Jacqueline
wild
Morum was
fight.
another one. What happened?
That was a wild fight, wasn't it?
Absolutely wild fight. Morum looked great early on, and then kind of similar to another guy in Rosas, basically fell apart. But the story is not with Sam Hughes' win. It originally was because it was a great performance. But the story has now changed, and at the post fight press conference, her revealing that her boyfriend bet $1,000 on her, which would put her in violation of the
Uh,
UFC betting policy.
yeah, it looks very much like that, unfortunately. Come on,
And Zan,
Sam.
this is
Come on, Sam Hughes. You didn't learn from the James Krause situation.
and Zan, you may not like what I say, and it's going to be harsh, but considering the James Krause situation, do you think the UFC will have to cut ties with Sam Hughes now?
If the UFC keeps their word and is going to adhere with their new policy, the answer is yes. Literally, according to their new policy written in stone, they they sort of have to. Do they not? I mean,
They kind of
isn't
have
that
to.
isn't that what the new policy is? That's my whole thought.
And you don't want this community, Zan, not just the UFC, but the MMA community, basically having to relive that Krause situation again. So now it's not obviously different circumstances, but I'm just talking about the black eye that was placed on the sport with the whole betting scandal at the end of last year. You can't have that be brought back up. So unfortunately, I think it's time for Sam Hughes to go. I think, what do you do from here? Does Sam Hughes get a contract with Bellator and she tries to rebuild herself there? Do you tell Sam Hughes to basically fight out the rest of this year on the regional circuit and let everything die down and try to bring her back next year? Like, what do you do there?
Or do we just or do anything, or does anything we just said not apply in the UFC does nothing about it, which is very well possible too.
And it's one of
Knowing that sometimes the UFC will make threats and then they don't follow through on what they actually claim. So
which I mean, I hate anything bad happening to Sam Hughes, but
me
I
too.
would, but I would still be very critical of the UFC. That James Krause situation was probably, Zan, the biggest scandal that this sport had ever seen, or at least one that it had ever seen in a long time.
Oh, it's probably the biggest MMA scandal in the history of the sport, in my opinion.
So something's got to be done there, unfortunately. All right, let's talk about some notes, Zan, from the post fight stuff. Actually, let's make reference, Zan, also to something that made me very happy yesterday. Robbie Lawler, Rory McDonald too will be heading the fight wing for the UFC Hall of Fame class of 2023. Zan, this is my second favorite fight of all time, behind Forrest Griffin versus Stephen Bonner. One, because that's the fight that got me into, really sold me into the UFC. But this fight, Zan, I know McGregor versus Mendez headlined UFC 189, but these guys took the freaking spotlight that night.
Oh, absolutely. It was on one of the best cards, not only of 2015, but one of the best cards in several years. Up to that point, the UFC
Like, it's
had.
one of the best. Sorry, Zan. I'm just gonna say UFC 189 is one of the best UFC pay-per-views ever, all time.
No, it was truly outstanding, and it's a disservice that it didn't get a million buys because the card was that good. But I just want to know, Tom, where do you remember watching Lawler versus McDonald too?
Right next door, right next door in my
Oh,
basement, kind of a man cave setup.
that's uh that's awesome. I remember watching it. I'm in my bedroom. I remember watching it in my living room out there, and yeah, it's just one of those fights. and I won't forget. I remember paying for it. I remember maybe having a couple of people over. I remember it was just one of those fights that you'll never forget. Like if you saw it the night of, you'll never forget it. And that was one of those fights for sure. And it's kind of sad from Rory McDonald's perspective though, because it was really the beginning of the end of his career after that. He was never the same.
No, absolutely. But I mean, you got to give him his flowers where they're due. He has recognized, you kind of want to feel bad for Roy McDonald because he was told 5 more minutes and you're the freaking champ, and it's true. But Lawler basically just completely broke him with a broken nose at the end of that fifth round. But regardless, one of the greatest fights ever. I talked to Rory McDonald during COVID, Zen, and Rory still says that this is his all-time favorite fight that he's ever been in, and it's nice to see that he is going to be heading into the Hall of Fame one way or another. He wasn't shown much in the video packages, but Zan, I think basically what that tells me is that they were waiting for Rory McDonald's time in Bellator and the PFL to run out so they could put this fight in.
For sure. And it's interesting that he wasn't shown much in the video package just because of how like historic the fight was. That's very interesting.
And it's really, but it is also really awesome that Robbie Lawler is entering the UFC Hall of Fame through this too, Zan. So now you've got Lawler and McDonald, you've got Anderson Silva, you've got Jose Aldo, Cowboy Cerrone, Jens Pulver. This Zan, this is a nutty class, a nutty Hall of Fame class.
Absolutely. And if you're in Vegas, you can go for free. So if you're in the area, you better be at the Hall of Fame ceremony Thursday night as an MMA fan, because it's one of those ceremonies you won't want to miss.
No, absolutely. I'll be tuning in to watch every induction. It's kind of absolutely nuts. And like you said, Zan, like you said, a class like this, an international fight week like this, deserves a big headliner. So here's hoping Jones and Stipe again come through.
Well said, and it's kind of unfortunate, although I do think the UFC will figure it out. I did the UFC pay per view math, and it looks like, per my calculations, UFC 300 will take place in May of 2024. But something tells me the UFC will drag it out a little while longer to where UFC 300 will take place in its rightful place in July of 2024, as did UFC 200 in July of 2016 and UFC 100 in July of 2009. So we'll see.
Maybe Sam we just have a marathon of fight nights throughout like March and April next year or something.
Well, hey, that would make a whole lot of sense. And for the first time in a long time, you'll probably have a UFC pay per view in February, just because you have the Super Bowl there in the same weekend. And Dana White hinted at Radio Row that he wants to do a UFC pay per view the night before the Super Bowl, which would make Vegas the destination to be next, next February, with a massive UFC event on Saturday and, of course, the Super Bowl the following day. But
Yeah.
that's an outstanding induction. Congratulations to both guys. It's one of my favorite fights ever too. It has to be in my top five, without a doubt. And Robbie Lawler is just real. It's a real class act. I have a really quick personal story, if you don't mind. This is about 13 or so years ago. Well,
Mm-hmm.
This is when Robbie Lawler was still he was kind of irrelevant. He had lost a bunch in a row, and it was before his fight with Lorenz Larkin. And I was walking down the street in Indianapolis. This is the week of UFC 119, and my dad looks over at me and he goes, "Zan, is that Robbie Lawler?" And I look up and I go, "Yeah, that's definitely Robbie Lawler." And I go up to him and I introduce myself and I'm like, "Hey, do you remember that you knocked out Nick Diaz at UFC 47?" And in typical Robbie Lawler action, because his short term memory is a lot better than his long term memory goes, "Zan, I don't even remember who I fought last month.
God.
Who I fought in 2004." And I'm like, do I have to remind you who you're fighting in a couple months? He's like, "No, I know who I'm fighting in a couple months." But just to see him 5 years before that Robbie Lawler fight, be in that place, and then 5 years later become the UFC welterweight champion. It's one of the greatest MMA comeback stories of all time.
That's good. That's really good. Do I have to remind you who you're fighting in a couple? Uh, well, Robbie's a legend. I've gotten to talk
No,
to Robbie last year, and he is a legend.
no, he absolutely is, and I'm very jealous of you that you got to talk to Robbie Lawler and I didn't. But
One day, maybe.
nonetheless, though, it's a Hall of Fame fight, two absolute legends of the sport, and it's a fight that, in my opinion, and you may know about this trilogy yourself, being a boxing guy too, but that fight felt like the UFC's version of God Ward One. That's what that fight felt like to me, in
Mhm.
my opinion. If you haven't seen those Gotti word trilogy, that whole sequence of fights, that's another story. But that's the one fight that comes to mind. If you want to make a boxing comparison to Lawler McDonald too, it's without a doubt Gotti word one, in my opinion.
For sure. Zed, speaking of Hall of Fame, we actually had, it's funny that the Endeavor WWE deal went down last week because we had some WWE Hall of Famers at Cage Side.
You
That
sure did.
being that being Kid Rock, Mike Tyson, and the 45th United States President Donald Trump.
Yeah, wouldn't it be a UFC event in Miami with Donald Trump coming from Mar-a-Lago to the event, right?
I mean, Zed, what did you think of that image that was starting to make its rounds of everybody on the row of Dana in one seat, the former president beside him, Kid Rock beside him, and Mike Tyson beside him.
Well, I mean, the caption that takes the cake and is still going viral as we're recording this is in the Bane Davis's tweet that now has over 1,100 retweets, and it's just absolutely hilarious. In fact, it's so funny that I have to read it. Hang on.
Okay.
And it is his caption was insane blunt rotation, and it currently has 1,307 retweets. It totally
Insane what?
1,000 insane blunt rotation.
And what tops this picture for me, Zan, what really tops this picture for me is if you look in the background, you actually see Aaron Boone, the manager of the New York Yankees, him having a post-game press conference. So I'm assuming that was Trump who was watching the Yankees press conference, and it's like funny, Zan, because there's this Yankees podcast, Talking Yanks, who basically so Aaron Boone had the walk-off home run Game 7 of 2003 American League Championship Series, and the Talking Yanks account took that picture of Dana, Trump, and all of them, quote tweeted it, and basically said, "Well, the 2003 ALCS picture of Aaron Boone is no longer his famous picture."
Yeah, no kidding.
That's just absolutely random that it's happened, and it's more nutty considering the circumstances that are going on with Trump at this moment.
No, it's very true. It's very true. And it's even crazier that when he was shown on screen with this graphic and everything, the crowd went crazy.
It's
By the way,
Florida.
the same thing happened in Vegas when he was shown on screen. The T-Mobile Arena went nuts. It was absolutely it was like surreal. Like people were sitting near me. One half of my section was cheering. I will go over next to me. The other half of my section is booing. It was surreal. And this is when he was still president at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh god. All right. Let's a couple of notes from the press conference. By the way, some of them, Zan, we're gonna run through because we've already made reference to them. Obviously, Nunes versus Pena 3 has been confirmed for the UFC's return to Vancouver. The UFC's actually let's just scratch it. The UFC's return to Canada. Period. The first time they've gone to Canada since the pandemic. UFC 289 in Vancouver. I think Vancouver, Zan, is where the last time they were in Canada was too. I think it was like September 2019. I think that was the Cowboy Gaethje fight.
You were exactly you were exactly right. Mr. Unofficial MMA Historian, because it was September. It was September of 2019. It was during the early stages of the ESPN deal, and I believe it was one of those exclusive ESPN Plus cards, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, it has been a
Yeah.
long time since they've been to Canada.
So, and
And of,
again,
and of, and of course, Canadian MMA Twitter is losing their minds because they get Nunes versus Pena 3 over any other fight that could have been the headliner. That's the fight they get. By the way, if I was a citizen of Canada, I would be pissed too.
Canada is cursed when it comes to the UFC. Zain, I can't help but think of uh, it's an old video from an account called It's Not Cage Fighting, and they're talking about some of the worst UFC cards of all time, and they're basically talking about one UFC card, and I think it was in Vancouver, and they were and basically Dana, it was so bad that Dana apologized and said we will try to make it up next time that we're in Canada, and the next time that they were there, Zan, was the Nunes Shevchenko rematch, and I just love the voiceover that said,
Oh, you're
"Oh
oh you're
dear."
thinking of you're thinking of UFC 149 in Calgary, where Dana said that
Yes.
where Dana said that they owed Calgary an event, and it was just like crickets. They didn't hear anything after that. Yeah.
And then I think one of the next times that they hang on, let me go back. Nunes versus Shevchenko was 215 or 16? 215, yeah.
215.
215. And that's when they went to Edmonton again in Alberta. And that's when Nunes Shevchenko too. And it's like, yeah, we're gonna make it up to you. Here's Nunes Shevchenko too. Which again, one of the biggest robberies I think in mixed martial arts and women's mixed martial arts. And
Without a
now
doubt.
and now they're going to Vancouver and Nunes Pena 3. Yeah, because we need a trilogy for our fights, and like you mentioned before, ended last time with 50-43 scorecard.
Because of course it did, and then of course it goes along with the same theme. The event they had in Calgary was Uriah Faber versus Tenon Barrow, and that fight was a one-sided decision from the second the fight started. So the UFC has a knack of putting really one-sided championship fights as their main event in Canada. It's very weird.
So Zen, what's your prediction for Nunes Pena 3? How bad do you see the scorecard?
I
Because
I
here's
think
how I'm gonna
go ahead.
50-41. I think we get worse. I think it actually gets more one-sided.
I think Nunes finishes from the third round.
Here's hoping that we get a finish for that kind of fight. Jeez Louise. Uh,
It better
this
be it better be a good undercard. Otherwise, it's probably not even worth tuning into half of it.
probably not. We talked about this one. Burns actually demanded that he be the backup for Leon Edwards, Colby Covington, and White basically said at the press conference, "Okay, done."
So that leads me to one question and one question only: Is Dana White privilege a real thing?
And that left me to another question. Where does Kevin Lee fit into all of this?
you just had to do it. You had to say it.
I did have to say it. Where does Kevin Lee fit in all this?
The answer is nobody knows.
I don't think Kevin Lee even knows where he fits into all of this.
No, I
Um,
don't think so. That goes into the all-time MMA Hall of Fame memes with Tony Ferguson is the type of guy. It fits in that identical category.
this one I'm gonna bring up because we talked about it last week. Dana basically mentioned the WWE deal in very PR terms. I like the deal, but not really going into it. But basically, as we kind of said, Zen, it looks like there are going to be no major changes to the UFC under this new merger.
No, but he did bring up a very interesting caveat, which was, if you caught that, the WWE's rights deal is up very soon, he thinks that Ari Emanuel is the guy to get them a media rights deal that Endeavor feels fits with the WWE's business, which
which
leads me
means then,
to go ahead, go ahead.
sorry, no, but I know what you're talking about, which leads me to believe, Dan, like I kind of teased on our last episode, like I teased on Empty the Bench. I've got a feeling that Ari and Endeavor are basically going to try and basically swoop in and take SmackDown from Fox and get it to ESPN.
Yeah, which would make a lot of sense, and I think it would make ESPN Plus a crap ton of money too. I think a lot of people would be very interested.
I think I think it's gonna be tough to get Raw because Monday Night Raw because that has been an NBC Universal staple since 1990. It's been on the USA Network since 1993, with the exception of a 5-year period it was on Spike. Um, so I think it's gonna be tougher to get that away from NBC Universal. I think it would be really interesting though, Zan, like we kind of mentioned last week, when the Peacock deal runs out in 2026, does ESPN Plus get the WWE network and they get all the WWE rights with the past content?
It could very well happen because
Um, yep.
you probably have seen this too in the last several months. ESPN wants to get to a level where you open the ESPN app and you'll be able to access any game, any sporting event directly through that app, even if it means redirecting you to a different app. They want to have ESPN be the place where if you want to find your game or you want to find your fight, you go to ESPN or ESPN Plus, you click on whatever you want, it takes you right to it. That's their goal.
And yeah, getting the WWE network rights would be certainly a step in that direction.
Without a doubt.
Uh, and one last thing here before we wrap up. So Dana also mentioned that he was asked about returning to London in July. He basically confirmed, and he says he's looking to make that a pay-per-view. According to Damon Martin of MMA Fighting, basically, Zan, the plan for this July is kind of a merge between what we got last July and what we got in March, in which the UFC will hold two pay-per-views a couple of weeks apart from one another. In March, it was two. This case, it would be three, like last July, with UFC 290 International Fight Week in Las Vegas on July 8th. And then 3 weeks later, July 29th, UFC 291 in London.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Has there ever been another? Trying to go back in my head of UFC pay per views. Has there been another time where they've done something like this in the month of July, where they've held two pay per views in the same month?
Last year. Last year, they had 276, 277. Because that's Zan. That was when we were starting this podcast. That
That's
was our
right.
pilot.
That's right. 277 was the same weekend that 291 is going to be. You were exactly right. So by the time we get to 291 in London, we will have hit a year of this very show. Yeah, yeah.
Which means then, so first of all, the fact that he was so jumpy that he admitted to this, and the fact that he was jumpy that Burns can beat a backup, that leads me to believe he's targeting Leon versus Colby probably for that weekend. I mean,
Yeah,
it's the month of July. Obviously, 4th of July is around. Obviously, you got the 4th of July, the Americana, plus Leon competing in his home country again. Did good numbers last time. That's leading me to believe 291 is going to be Edwards Covington.
that's going to be if that's the fight that happens in London, that's going to be a scene. Oh my goodness, that is going to be a scene. And he
Colby
even
Covington
said,
will be the biggest heel ever.
if you've never been to a fight, if you've never been to a fight in London, you have to go to a fight in London at some point. I'm teasing some potential summer vacation plans. If that's the fight, it's good. I don't know. I don't know if I would have missed that.
Also leads me to believe with the pay-per-view schedules, and that would have to mean so 7 days after July 29th, I want to say August 5th. Yeah. So 3 weeks. So that would lead me to believe 292 would be on August 19th if they went to and did an August pay-per-view at all. Like you said, Dan, unless they're going to try and really drag things out to try and get 300 as close to the summer of 2024 is possible.
Couldn't they drag out like 295 and 296? That way they wouldn't have to worry about the end of
I
23.
think they could do that as well. I think that, well, here's the thing. So August 19th is possible if they do an August card. September, you would have to look at September 9th or 16th, therefore, or unless you don't do an August, that you can do the 23rd, because the assumption, Zan, is September. I mean, it's suspicious that he's not doing any USADA testing, but that would lead me to believe that at some point, those middle weeks of September, we're going to get the Connor Chandler fight.
So you don't think it'll be in August because of the USADA
I
stuff?
don't think. I
I
think
don't think so
USADA.
either.
It just something smells, Zan. How is Conor McGregor not having a USADA test and it's April 9th?
I think it's going to be like a Brock Lesnar situation. He's going to try to get. There's going to be something. But I want to know, if you were to put your matchmaker cap on, who in your opinion would headline 292 in your opinion?
Depends. You're talking about if it takes place August 19th, like I think.
Right.
Okay.
And my prediction is that's when no, sorry, that's not going to be my prediction, because according to reports, what I was going to say is scheduled for June 24th. What was in my head was Jacksonville. My prediction is that August 19th is going to be in Texas. That's my
I can see Texas.
prediction for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see Texas, and I see. I don't know if you do a lightweight title fight, because perhaps I've got a feeling they're going to save Makachev for October for
Oh
for
yeah,
Abu
yeah.
Dhabi.
That's gonna be Makachev is gonna headline. Is gonna headline the Abu Dhabi card. That's my prediction.
All right, so
Because that's
that'd
what.
be out.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to go through. So that would be out welterweight. But I think, Zan, that August card, if it's all, I mean, if it 292 takes place in August in Texas, maybe they do the light heavyweight title fight. They do
Or
either.
or we can dream, because I have to say it. Or they bring Jamal Hill to Chicago, and we finally get our long-awaited Chicago card in August. Please, come on, please.
I hope for your sake, Sam, but I think you're dreaming. I think Texas is more
No,
likely.
I know.
And I think, Sam, as I was kind of alluded to, I think that's where they do either Hill versus Ankalaev or Hill versus Jiri, depending on how Jiri's progress is from injury.
Okay, well, hey, now that we have Texas in our heads, you don't think McGregor Chandler has a chance for Cowboy Stadium, or do you think that's more likely Allegiant Stadium? What do you think? Or do you think it's a
I
stadium
forgot
show
about
at
that.
all? Yeah.
I forgot about that. They're talking a big game about a stadium, but I think they're still going to be targeting it, but I've got a feeling that it's all going to be for naught, unless I see some sort of announcement that it's going to be in a stadium. I
Yeah, I
think
think so
Sand.
too. I
I
think
think
so
it's
too.
Sand more and more. Sorry, I think it's more and more likely that it's just going to be the generic with Connor, T-Mobile, in Vegas.
Which makes sense, because if you want to do Cowboy Stadium, it has to be for a title, and that's a non-title fight. So that doesn't make sense. Yeah.
And for Cowboy Stadium, 100,000 ish people, 90 to 100,000 ish people, you would need McGregor. You would need basically a light heavyweight or heavyweight title fight. Like you would need McGregor in 2 title fights or McGregor in 3 title fights for 90 to 100,000 people at Cowboy Stadium. You would need the
Yeah.
biggest UFC card of all time.
Yeah, and no offense, the UFC's current roster is great, but I don't think they'd be able to do a super mega card with the current roster that they have. Although I could be wrong. I could be very wrong about that. But looking at the landscape,
You
I
would
don't.
basically then
Go
sorry,
ahead, go
you
ahead.
would basically need McGregor and John Jones on the same card.
Yeah, which at this point will probably never happen, because Jones always goes back into it and always goes back into hiding every single time he fights. So,
Ooh.
yeah, I think the UFC's dream of Cowboy Stadium is good, but I don't think McGregor Chandler is the right fight. for Cowboy Stadium. You know what is the right fight for Cowboy Stadium, and I know it's a dream, but if he does make his way back to the UFC, Francis versus John Jones is the right fight for Cowboy Stadium. Whether that's in boxing or in mixed martial arts. So yeah, there you go.
All right, that was fun.
That was very
Uh,
fun. I had a great time. That was awesome.
a lot we delved into, and we'll talk more this coming week, this coming Wednesday on episode 33, I believe it is,
Yep.
of the MMA Outsiders.
Yep, it's
So we'll get into
33.
more. We'll get into more about 287. We'll preview the UFC Kansas City card this coming weekend, headlined by Max Holloway and Arnold Allen. We'll talk about PFL 2's main event. We'll talk about We'll preview the PFL 3 card this coming weekend. More that we've got to get into as we're making our way through spring. Hopefully, Zan, in a very quick, by the speed of light, will be in an exciting MMA summer.
For sure. And we also have an exciting interview coming up that I'm very excited to conduct ahead of One Championship's first US show as well. That'll be dropping very soon, hopefully.
Yes, absolutely. We'll get into more details as that comes about. But for now, that's Zan. I'm Tom. Thank you for tuning in, everybody. Make sure you hit that like button. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let me go through this stuff one more time. You can make sure to follow us across social media, MMA Outsiders ETB, and you can follow the network across social media, TikTok included, at ETB Network. That's Zain Bando. You can find his work over at bjpen.com, and you can find him on Twitter at Zambando99. I'm Tom Albano, contributor to Fansided MMA. That's where you can find my work, and you can find me on Twitter at Thomas J. Albano. And yeah, that's going to do it. So for Zan, I'm Tom. We'll see you next time, guys. Thank you for tuning into this UFC 287 post show. Take care. Enjoy your day. And for those who celebrate, happy Easter.
Yeah, for those who celebrate Happy Easter, thanks again for tuning in, and we will see you guys next week, normal time and normal place. We'll see you guys then.